Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Rockefeller Center, welcome to tonight's Rocky Watch event. Oren Cass, Executive Director of American Compass, will deliver the Brooks Family Lecture. Before we get started, a couple of Zoom details. You can ask your questions at any time by using the Q&A button. To upvote a question that you would like to hear answered, click on the thumbs up icon. Questions with the most votes will rise to the top. To access Zoom's closed captioning feature, navigate to live transcript and select show subtitle. If you don't see that option, look under the more button. And there may be a slide or two during tonight's event. To see both the slide and the speaker, find the view options button and click on side by side. You can change the size of the slides by hovering your pointer in the dividing line between the two and dragging to make the slide bigger. And finally, when you leave tonight's webinar, you will see a survey. It's a big help to us if you would take the time to answer the 3 short questions that you'll find there. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our host for the evening, Senior Lecturer and Policy Fellow at the Rockefeller Center, Professor Charles Wheelan. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Joanne. And it's my pleasure to welcome Oren. Before I introduce him, I want to say the Brooks Family Lecture Series was established in 1990 by Babert Dexter Brooks of Westport, Connecticut. Mr. Brooks graduated from Dartmouth in 1947 and from the Tuck School of Business in 1949. Our speaker tonight is Oren Cass, who is the Executive Director of American Compass and the author of The Once and Future Worker, A Vision for the Renewal of Work in America, which came out in 2018. He's a contributing opinion writer for the Financial Times. He's also written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other places. He was the domestic policy director for Mitt Romney in 2011 and 2012. Oren, welcome. You're going to offer some remarks, and I'll be back to ask you a few questions when you're done.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here virtually. In fact, it's especially lovely to be able to be places virtually. Really appreciate the invitation and want to thank the Rockefeller Center, especially for the very thoughtful title they gave this presentation. I'm terrible with titles, and you all suggested as the subtitle, what it is, how we lost it, and how we find it again, which just makes my job a lot easier. I have the 3 sections of what I want to talk about. And so that is exactly what I want to talk about. What is happening with conservatism? First of all, what is conservatism? How have we lost it? And how do we find it again? Because I think, I myself would describe myself as a conservative, but at the same time, I would say I am someone who believes that a healthy democratic polity is characterized by robust conservative and progressive perspectives, and the give and take between them, the ability of one to check the other, and the nation ultimately finding its way, muddling its way through is I think the best we can hope to do. And I think in recent decades we have had a lack of genuine conservatism in our politics, and we are suffering for it. So let me begin with question 1, conservatism, what is it? And I suppose to do the easy thing first, let me say what it is not. I think sometimes we have a sense of conservatism as essentially just wanting things to be the way they are, opposition to change, returning to an earlier time. So a conservative in 1750 probably thinks slavery is fine. A conservative in 1850 is starting to think slavery is not a good idea. A conservative in 1950 is obviously against slavery. That would be the cliched view of conservatism, but I don't think that's right. I am partial to Sam Huntington's definition of it, the great political theorist. He said, when the foundations of society are threatened, the conservative ideology reminds men of the necessity of some institutions and the desirability of the existing ones. And I think that captures well what it is that conservatism contributes to our political and to our policy thinking. It recognizes the value of what we have, notices the importance of institutions in particular, and counsels caution in the way that we go about change. And this is maybe best illustrated by Edmund Burke himself. Edmund Burke, the great, technically Irish, but ultimately British statesman, who I think is rightly recognized as the father of modern conservatism. Burke famously, within just a few years, both supported the American Revolution and opposed the French Revolution. And his reasons for those choices, I think, are quite telling. He supported the American Revolution, even though he was a representative of Great Britain, on the grounds that Great Britain was essentially violating its own commitment to the colonies. It was engaged in overbearing administration. It had irrevocably breached the relationship, and he saw that the American colonies, in governing themselves, would be best able to carry on their own traditions and celebrate their own character. The French Revolution, by contrast, he saw as a radical mob essentially tearing away all the guardrails of a society. And on that basis, even though he had just applauded what the Americans were doing, he said what's going on in France is an abomination. And I think, among other things, it's important to note that he was exactly right on both counts. that if there's something to be said for conservatism at a time when most people would either have been blindly pro-revolution or blindly pro-monarchy, there was something in the conservative sensibility that said, actually, these are two quite different things. Fast forward and fast all the way forward to the modern day, and social psychologist Jonathan Haidt. Haidt, I think, has produced an especially useful framework for thinking about how conservatism and by contrast progressivism plays out in a lot of our political and policy debates. And he does this by identifying 6 different dimensions of moral intuition that he says are especially relevant to how people assess moral and political questions. And the 6 are: first, care, just whether we feel, I will oversimplify, but essentially whether we feel people are being cared for. 2, liberty. 3, fairness. 4, loyalty. 5, authority. And 6, sanctity. And all 6 of those are considerations that undermine people's moral judgments. The striking thing about conservatives is the extent to which they take all 6 into account. Progressives tend to focus very directly on the care dimension. Are we giving care to those who need it? Libertarians, of course, focus very aggressively on the liberty dimension, almost to the exclusion of all others. Conservatives are certainly aware of the concern about care. They would like to care for people. They certainly care about liberty. They value liberty and freedom. They certainly care about fairness. They also care a lot, though, about loyalty. They care about authority. They care about sanctity. And they tend to balance these things to a significant degree in making decisions. So as a shorthand, I like to say the conservative outlook on things tends to be a shrug and a remark that it's complicated. Because, in fact, most things are complicated. And so for conservatives, it seems to me, the assessment of public policy goes along certain distinctive lines. One is recognition of progress as a process of accumulation. That is, we don't make progress by ripping up what we have and replacing it with something better. We make progress by, at the margins, asking, where could something be improved? One of the reasons we do that is because we approach governing with humility and with an appreciation for what's already been accomplished. I think conservatives particularly have, frankly, a very skeptical view of human nature and see the success that we have had in building a human civilization at all as, frankly, something of a miracle, something that's quite fragile and something that we should appreciate for its successes and be wary of disturbing. I think conservatives, as we were talking about those different dimensions that conservatives think about, as a result, tend to be less focused on individual freedom and choice than a lot of folks in our particularly our Western liberal debates, and to concentrate a lot more on things like obligation, to think a lot more about constraints, and recognize that those ideas are actively valuable and can contribute to people's flourishing. In concrete terms and economic terms in particular, think about what that means then for markets. Today, we think of conservative economics in America as synonymous with a very absolutist free market perspective. But I don't think that's actually conservative at all. Certainly historically, it was not. There are ways in which conservatives certainly are quite enthusiastic about markets, rightfully so. Markets limit central government, they give power to the people who are often best positioned to make choices about their own lives. Markets evolve over time in response to real world conditions, which is a much better course of evolution than simply leaving things to a technocrat's whim. Markets are themselves institutions that encourage people to develop codes of conduct and formal rules and to negotiate with each other to find the best outcomes. At the same time, though, I think genuine conservatives have some real reasons to be skeptical of markets. One reason is that markets reduce people to material interests and transactions. Certainly, those things are important, but they're also entirely incomplete. Second, markets prioritize efficiency to the almost absolute exclusion of other values like resilience, sentiment, tradition. And so just as in making moral judgments, I think conservatives see a lot to think about beyond just care or liberty. In assessing how well markets are generating outcomes for society, conservatives will want to see efficiency, want to see material prosperity, but will also be concerned about other values that might be going overlooked. And finally, I think conservatives are likely to be very wary about the way that when unconstrained, markets will tend to really erode the foundations of a lot of the social institutions that we rely on. Here, I think the family is a particularly good example. The ways in which, in pursuit of market efficiency, you are likely to see households much more likely to send two full-time workers into the labor force, even though on the flip side, the market will give very little attention to what that does both to familial relations in the household and also investments in non-market ways in the community. Another example of this is agglomeration and the way that markets will celebrate the concentration of talent and resources in narrow places where they can work together most productively, even though from the society-wide perspective, skimming all the talent and all the resources and putting them in one place are likely to cause a lot more misery than joy. So hopefully that gives a sense of what I mean by conservatism and the outlook that a conservative or conservatism would bring to our policy debates. Obviously, it's not what we have today in America on the right of center, generally speaking. And is a fair question, well, what happened? How did we lose it? I think the best explanation is to understand the nature of the right of center coalition, and in particular, what's called fusionism. Which is the coalition that was brought together in the right of center, essentially in the era between Goldwater and Reagan. So the 60s to the 80s, in the context of the Cold War, that brought together three groups, brought together social conservatives, who are most likely to have the outlook I've just described, brought together social conservatives with economic libertarians, who tend to be very focused on safeguarding markets and freedom, and foreign policy hawks, particularly Cold War hawks, who saw the Soviet Union as a particularly dramatic threat. Now, these three groups had a tremendous amount in common, and especially in the context of the Cold War, a political alliance among them made a lot of sense. I think it's also worth noting that essentially these three groups together won the Cold War. And so I'm certainly not here to criticize the achievements that they made. But there were also compromises. And what essentially happened is that the foreign policy hawks did foreign policy, even though that sort of outlook was not necessarily inherently conservative. The economic libertarians did the economic policy for the most part. And the social conservatives did mostly social policy, but I think played little role in economic policy debates. And so over time, what we came to think of as right of center or conservative economic policy actually became quite quite ossified as a set of libertarian dogmas that took the free market to essentially be the end unto itself, trusted it to always deliver the best outcome, and to a significant extent, even if it wasn't delivering the best outcome, said, well, that's just too bad because the free market is essentially the first principle. I often cite a conversation I had for a podcast with Jack Spencer, who's head of economic policy at the Heritage Foundation. And he asked me why, when we evaluate policy, why not simply ask the question, does it advance economic freedom? And my response was, well, I think that's a great question to ask. but first of all, that can't possibly be the only thing we would want to know. And secondly, there are an awful lot of policy questions where it seems almost beside the point. And so I think that mindset of we can make policy simply by asking, does it advance economic freedom, came to be very prevalent, but ultimately left a tremendous amount to be desired. And so I want to give an illustration of where I think this kind of thinking leads. And we'll see if I successfully share my screen here. Apologies if I hang up on all of you. All right. Professor Wheelan, nod if I've successfully shared my screen. Excellent, thank you. So one of the things that we've seen as this sort of very strong focus on market efficiency as an end unto itself took over, with it came this obsessive focus on the so-called economic pie. The idea that the purpose of our economic policy was to grow the economic pie, as if the economy was a pie. Everyone loves pie, and we're going to have as much pie as we can. The implications of this I like to illustrate with this map that you can hopefully see, and next to it a little green bar. The map shows for every county in the United States the share of income that was coming through government transfer payments. So how much income is earned by people working, and how much is provided through government programs of redistribution. And what you can see is back in 1979, we were essentially a sort of light pale beige country. So almost all counties are in sort of the 10 to 20% transfer payments bucket. And then over to the right, you can see the total size of the economy, about $6.5 trillion. And if you look at what happened in the following 4 decades, 1979, fast forward to 2014, 2 things happened. One, the green bar shoots up. We dramatically expanded our total economic output. We had much more stuff. And the other thing you can see is that the map turns splotchy dark red. Everywhere gets at least some part somewhat darker. Actually, if you look very closely, you'll see a few of the key kind of metro areas like San Francisco and Boston don't. But pretty much the whole map gets darker, and some parts turn bright red. There are significant parts of the country that jump into the 50% plus transfer payment category. Now, there are 2 ways of looking at this. If you believe the rhetoric of the economic pie, you would technically define this as success. We grew the economic pie dramatically, and we in fact implemented very aggressive programs of redistribution into those areas that were not sharing in the prosperity. And it is in fact the case that if you evaluate just in terms of consumption, pretty much everybody at every income level in America is better off than they were in the past. We've been very successful at making more stuff and getting it to everybody. And yet, I think most of us look at this and say, actually, something has gone very wrong. It is the conservative intuition within us that says, just having enough stuff isn't the whole name of the game. Certainly, we want to accomplish that. You know, I'm not suggesting we all live in cabins in the woods. I like stuff too. But if this is the pattern of development, if we develop in not only an unequal way, but a way that increasingly leaves some communities essentially reliant on redistribution, something will have gone very wrong. And responding to this with yet more redistribution, of course, is not going to set it right. I like to ask people, and if this were a live event, we could do a hand-raising thing, but I will pose the question to you all anyway. I like to pose a hypothetical that you've been given a button A big red staples that was easy button. And it's called the 20% button. If you push the button, let me get rid of my shared screen if I can do that successfully. Let's see. Oh, there we go. All right. So you have this big red button in front of you. It's called the 20% button. And if you push the button, two things will happen. The first thing will happen is that the top quintile of earners in our society, so the most productive people, will become twice as productive. The second thing that will happen is that the bottom quintile of earners, the least productive people, will all lose their jobs. Now, if you want, you can hypothesize that you're going to also create a transfer program to redistribute from the more productive to the people who lost their jobs, so everybody ends up with more stuff than they had before. Would you push the button? And I particularly like posing this question to business school students, and I was posing it to a group of students in what's called the Adam Smith Society, which is a group for sort of pro-market business students. And almost simultaneously, half of them said, yes, of course, and the other half said, no, of course not. And I think that captures perfectly the libertarian conservative divide, that if the goal is simply to achieve as much efficiency as possible, and we can then make sure everybody has enough stuff, we've been doing a great job. If the goal is actually to make sure our economy and our society is progressing in a way that's going to be healthy and inclusive, again, not just through redistribution, but through the actual trajectory of our economic progress, then we have a real problem. And so what I think conservatives need to do, and this is now part 3, how do we get this back? Partly conservatives need to declare independence. And this is the work that we do at American Compass, is merely to assert that there is such a thing as economic conservatism. And the libertarian dogma that we tend to hear on the right of center is not it. I think libertarians make a number of good points. I think they should be part of the policy conversation, but they can't be driving the car. And that conservatives need to actually bring their own intuitions back to the discussion and develop those atrophied muscles for actually engaging in the economic policymaking process from a perspective of conservative values, rather than simply through a faith that the free market will work. And I think there's an incredible opportunity at this moment to do this, because the problems of today cry out for it. If I were to list sort of, there are obviously problems that have always been with us, but if I were to list some of the problems that are new and have emerged in recent years, I think there are 4 that I would highlight. One is China. China as an economic competitor, China as a great power geopolitical competitor, and frankly, the conservative view that takes seriously nationalism and the idea of a national interest, that recognizes that the market is not going to be the right way to manage a relationship with a communist authoritarian dictatorship. I think the conservative view has a lot to contribute there. Second, technology. I think the role that digital technology is playing in our society today, in our economy today, is remarkably unique. It is a transition on the scale of the Industrial Revolution, and it poses a set of challenges that frankly, a place where progressives and libertarians tend to be very much in agreement in their enthusiasm for the next big thing, the next new thing, are ill-equipped to see the damage that it can be doing in a lot of cases, whereas conservatives, I think, are more attuned to it. Third, I think we have a problem with family in this country. And I don't mean that in the sort of generic family values sense that it's been used in our politics in recent decades. I mean it in the very hard economic policy sense that we are not forming enough families and having enough kids. And that is exactly what you would expect based on a sort of rigorous application of market logic. And we need a much more conservative perspective on what it is we actually value, that GDP can't possibly measure, that the market is not possibly going to incentivize or reward, and yet that is incredibly important to our flourishing as individuals, as families, communities, and as a nation. And then finally, I think we have a serious problem with inequality. To some extent, there is income inequality. To a much larger extent, we have a problem with wealth inequality. And we have a very big problem with regional inequality, with different parts of the country going in very different directions. And obviously the libertarian attitude of essentially being unconcerned with inequality is not responsive to that. But as I hope my map suggests, I think the more progressive attitude that the way to solve it is through redistribution is not responsive either. And I think the conservative focus on actually asking what are the institutions in the market and constraints on the market that would allow our economy to develop in a more inclusive way is a perspective that has simply not been prevalent in the policy discussion and needs to be. So there are a number of different policies, sort of concrete areas we could talk about. I think I want to get to Q&A sooner rather than later, but we can jump into policy areas that folks are interested in. I think a few that conservatives in particular are beginning to lead on and can lead on. One is the future of organized labor and the idea that unions as they work today are not working. The Amazon case in the news lately has been a fascinating illustration of that. But that the idea of labor as an institution is something that I think conservatives deeply value and should want to see be successful. I think our approach to education and rejecting the college for all mindset in favor of one that really supports a lot of different pathways for people is incredibly important. And then I think another area that we spend a lot of time at American Compass on is the idea of what's called industrial policy, which is the idea that actually the way that the market is going to allocate investment in the country is going to be very efficient for maximizing investor profits, but it's not going to reflect the allocation of investment that is actually going to benefit the nation as a whole over the long run. And the funny thing about this is ultimately a return to the economic thinking of the early American Republic. There was for many years what was called the American system. It was pioneered by, well, ultimately by Alexander Hamilton. It's most associated with Henry Clay. Abraham Lincoln was a great proponent of it, and it relied on three things. One, a national bank, the idea that the government needs to play a role in facilitating investment. Two, internal improvements, what we would today call infrastructure. And three, very high tariffs. The US was probably the most protected market in the world, certainly between the Civil War and World War II. And that obviously coincided with a great deal of success in development here in this country. And so obviously the policies of today will be different, but the idea that the secret sauce of American success is just libertarian, laissez-faire free market capitalism, again, is not conservative and is not necessarily consistent with our traditions. I think the conservative view will consider much more seriously the role that public policy has to play. And so that is, I hope, where conservatism heads. I think politically there's a great deal of promise in it moving in that direction. There's a lot of focus today on the idea of a more multi-ethnic working class conservatism that, if it were to bring these ideas forward, I think would have the potential to find a governing majority in this country. And I think having these views more prevalent in our policy debates will ultimately serve the nation very well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Oren. I want to remind everybody you can enter your question in the Q&A section, and you can upvote other questions if you want. But I will start. I'll take my prerogative here. Oren, I'm going to read you a line from your own book, and you're going to put it in context. I think it's an important line because it really carves out an enormous distinction between your approach and its focus on working and some of the other things that have been put forward in terms of how we might deal with inequality. So the line is, we have reached a point where the rich think paying everyone else to go away represents compassionate thinking. And just to refresh your memory, it refers to a commencement address. So if you could talk about that and how your view on work is really different than that approach to dealing with inequality.
Yeah, it's funny. I think my key example of this is now President Joe Biden, who famously liked to say, "Don't tell me what your values are, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what your values are." And we have an idea in this country that essentially the way you prove compassion and help those who are being left behind is to send them more stuff. And that's reflected, in the Joe Biden mindset. I think it's reflected also in the more kind of techno-optimist Silicon Valley mindset that's very focused on ideas like a universal basic income. And I think it's really important to recognize that that sort of economic redistribution not only doesn't solve our problems, but it's popular precisely because it's actually the easiest thing to do. That for those who are really doing well in this society, roughly those with, at least college degrees, often graduate degrees in professions that use those degrees, just writing a bigger check, that's the easy part. Whereas if you think about the kinds of things we actually need, if we are going to rebuild some of the institutions in this country that would put us on a more sustainable trajectory, it comes down a lot more to solidarity. It comes down a lot more to recognizing that we have a lot that we all owe to each other in this country, that this is only going to work if we take those obligations seriously, and if we therefore engage in what I would call social redistribution, which is the idea that a lot of the ways that we have simply organized society to the benefit of the well-off probably aren't the right way to do things. And so just to give a few concrete examples, one that I mentioned a minute ago is education. We have changed our high schools into college prep academies. And then to anyone who says, well, gosh, that seems to not be working for a lot of people, maybe we need to offer other pathways as well, the response in recent decades has essentially been, boo, you support tracking, why don't you believe everyone can reach their full potential? And the very funny thing about this is, of course, unless you're going to hire everybody in the country a personal tutor, you are going to have tracks. You can only provide so many different things. The problem with our College for All model is we've said we're only going to have one track, and it is going to be the college track, which works really well for people who are going to succeed in college. Now, most Americans still don't earn even a community college degree. So if we're really only going to have one track and we don't want to put people on different tracks, we should really just have a non-college track. And parents who care about getting their kids ready for college, can be the ones who have to, send their kids to a different school 3 towns over. Now, if you said that's what not tracking means, then you can bet all of those upper middle class tracking opponents would very quickly get on board with the idea of tracking. But we really need to think about something like an education system and ask, how can it actually meet people where they are and prepare them for ways in which they will be successful? Another example I think that's really important is in the globalization context, where we have essentially said that the best economic model is the one that facilitates the greatest free flow of people, goods, and capital across borders. And that is something that benefits some people in some professions and some sort of parts of the country and who have some priorities. And it does not benefit people in other parts of the country, in other industries, and with other priorities. And so while we like to think that we can sort of make very global arguments that X or Y is always good for everyone, somehow it always seems to be that the thing that's good for everyone is the thing that's actually good for the people who are already doing pretty well. And so those are the concessions I think we really need to see people in the word elite means many different things, but ultimately that we need to see elites making if we are going to have a country that we can say actually works for everybody.
So there are a couple issues you didn't mention, obviously, because you had not too much time, but in the question and answer bar, people have asked, what might be the conservative approach to climate change?
So climate change, I think, is a really interesting issue because there are so many different fights tied up within it. So I think as a starting point, conservatives, certainly better than, for instance, the Republican Party has done in recent years, need to sort of acknowledge the extent of the problem that exists. I think at the same time, they can do a very good job in pointing out some of the ways that the sort of predictions of doom are not supported by either the science or the economics. I'm very fond of pointing people to the model built by Bill Nordhaus, who just won the Nobel Prize for his work on this. And sort of figuring out, what is the right price for carbon if we're going to have a carbon tax and so forth, and what sort of damage does it assume that climate change is really going to do? And the estimate it generates is that climate change is going to reduce GDP in the year 2100 by roughly 3%. That's not 3% lower than today. That's 3% lower than it would otherwise be. So I'm trying to remember from last time I did this math. It's something like we'll be 6.1 times wealthier than today instead of 6.5 times wealthier than today. And so it's important to realize that while climate change is going to create a lot of very real problems in the 21st century that we're going to have to deal with, it is going to happen against a backdrop of progress and growth and development that also provides an enormous opportunity for adaptation. And it's going to proceed on a timeline that offers a tremendous opportunity for adaptation. And so I think something that conservatives can really contribute to the conversation is to say, look, we do need to be pursuing cleaner energy, and we certainly need to be investing in research and development that's going to bring us in that direction. But equally, we need to be investing in adaptation. We need to be setting up institutions and ensuring that our existing institutions are set up so that as climate change is occurring, we adapt to it. And if you actually adapt as you go along, then the actual costs at the end of the day will be a lot lower. And so I think conservatives can, by coming from a starting point of working from the best available science, both bring a very important voice that says, let's actually sort of take a society-wide perspective on how these kinds of changes are likely to play out. And then let's also recognize what government can and can't do. That simply trying to rip out one energy system and put in a different one isn't plausible and isn't going to happen, and wouldn't work if we tried. But that if we approach it thoughtfully, we can actually put institutions in place that are going to help us make progress.
There are a number of questions about families, one of which is, given the importance of family units at the core of society and the economy, what, if anything, can government do to strengthen families, promote the formation of families? And before you answer that question, I would ask you just to talk about a little bit of the research that you discuss in your book about the impact, in particular, of two-parent families on outcomes for children. It's something that the left doesn't like to talk a lot about, but the data are extraordinarily compelling.
Yeah, the family issue, I think, is a fascinating one. It's almost the converse of the climate change problem in that I think the the data on the nature of the problem and how concerned we need to be about it are quite clear, and yet we often don't even get to have that discussion because there's a first political question on which one side wants to suggest there isn't a problem, and so I think it's really important to emphasize, as you just said, that the data are quite clear, and a lot of very good, even left of center researchers like the Brookings Institution has done very good work documenting the importance of two-parent families. And I think the other thing that's really important to emphasize is a lot of it comes down to household stability. That two parents, for one thing, provide more resources, both economic resources and time, But the stable two-parent family also means the stable family, meaning there's an established relationship and setting that is conducive to child rearing. And, one thing that we have seen happen, obviously in recent decades, is a decline in that. The share of kids who will actually go from birth to age 18 in that environment is at this point roughly half. But to ask how could we improve that, we would have to have an explanation for what happened, which is obviously very contested. And then I think today we have a second problem at least as large, which is that families just aren't forming at all. That is that people of the millennial generation are on pace to get married and have children at just a much, much lower rate. Fertility rates and so forth were already on the decline. The Great Recession seems to have caused a real inflection point downward. And it's too soon to know the long-term effects, but COVID has the potential to produce a real inflection point downward as well. And so we have these dual problems of both family as a part of one's life being less in focus, and then the commitment to preserving a stable family structure for kids either being less in focus or just less achieved than it once was. And I think there are some elements of it that are purely cultural. And so I think there are important sort of cultural fights to be had. But then I think it's very important to recognize the role of economics, that, stable employment, particularly for men, is very closely tied to both family formation and family stability. That, we have gone from a society in which a single earner, with a high school degree really could support a family with even 3 or 4 kids, to one in which most families feel like they have to have 2 parents in the workforce. And we just did work at American Compass on this that found that, roughly half of families say they have fewer kids than they want. And when you ask them why, maybe unsurprisingly, it is split by class. For lower working and middle class households, the main reason is affordability. For upper class households, interestingly, they're almost as likely to say they have fewer kids than they want, but they will cite career pressures interfering more often. And so from the perspective of policymakers, I think there are a few different things that we can do. One is, I think we can just be much more family focused in how we make policy generally. That is, we can, as we think about whether it's urban planning or, regulation, or how health insurance works, we can try to do it in ways that put the concerns of the typical middle class family front and center, where they tend to be less often. And you see this most obviously in the childcare debates, where our debates are dominated by this idea that families want and need more affordable childcare, which is what the professional class in Washington and DC, in Washington, New York, that is leading these debates wants. But if you survey families nationwide, it is much, much more common for them to say they only want 1 parent in the workforce when they have young kids. And so if anything, they need the resources to be able not to have the second parent working. And so one policy idea that I think has gotten a lot of attention in the last couple of months, especially, and I think, hopefully there will be some real progress on, is the idea of some sort of family credit that really provides quite generous payments to families based on how many kids they have, in recognition of the added costs that they face that tend to occur in a time early in life when they can't have saved for them yet. And that makes it easier for that family to adopt the model that they would like, which is have 1 parent earning enough to support the family and have more kids than they're having.
Does anyone ever admit they have more kids than they want, or is that just the parents of teenagers?
They do. There is no shortage of unplanned pregnancies out there. But it is interesting to see the degree to which the way that we are sort of failing in having people reach their aspirations is in the shortfall of kids.
There are a couple of related questions asking how conservatism would address headline issues, one of which is, what does a conservative mindset have to offer around our discussion of race and policing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's one where, I'm always struck by how out of step the actual day-to-day debates are with the more kind of philosophical attitudes. Because if you take an issue like race, and the question of, for instance, systemic racism, or the degree to which historical inequities are going to, reverberate to today, it is the extraordinarily conservative view to recognize that the norms and traditions and inequities imprinted on a community over time are going to have tremendous effects on how people behave today in the kinds of opportunities they have available to them, and the obstacles they might face. Where it is actually the much more sort of progressive view to take a fairly blank slate view and think that each generation is born anew. And yet in the context of these debates, these things flip on their head, essentially because of the policy proposals that people want to advocate. And I think progressives tend to look at inequities in society today and be more inclined to say we sort of need to make radical root and branch change, whereas I think conservatives, as they are wont to do on almost any issue, both greatly dislike the suggestion that everything we have is wrong and needs to be redone, or that it is essentially kind of plausible or wise to attempt that. And so, it seems to me that we can make progress on both elements of that conversation. I think conservatives can do a much better job acknowledging the reality of the challenges and obstacles that various groups face today that can be the function of things that happened a long time ago. But at the same time, I think they rightly are going to be very skeptical of the idea that the solution is somehow to sort of undertake radical social change, or to throw out some of our basic principles around, the value of treating people as individuals, and rejecting the kind of identity politics that focuses on people as racial groups. So I think conservatives need to do a better job talking about the issue, but I don't think from a policymaking perspective, conservatives will or should be very interested in what I would call sort of race-based policy. I think in terms of sort of the remedy and the path forward, the focus has to be on finding ways to make the economy work better for whoever it is who has fallen behind. And if those who have fallen behind are disproportionately people of color, then those policies will rightfully and thankfully disproportionately help those people. But I think it's much better to talk about folks who are struggling and need help and how policies can help them, than to try to take a race-based lens to government policy.
For people who haven't read your book, I think they'd be surprised by how much you talk about unions and the potential that unions might have to help workers, which is not something traditionally associated with the Republican Party, not necessarily with conservatism. Could you mentioned the Amazon decision, but could we go back to that? Did the vote surprise you? And if you could explain that, and then just talk a little bit about your view of how, I guess I would call it labor relations 2.0 might help workers.
Yeah, I think it was always an uphill battle for the union to win that election. The size of the defeat, I think, was a little bit surprising, and maybe to some extent, underscores the extent to which the kind of very online, plugged in, Twitter and media universe disconnects from things happening out in the real world. But in my mind, it's disappointing, and I'll use this as an entry point to the more kind of the more general policy discussion. It's maybe inevitable, but disappointing to see that the reaction of everyone to the outcome is you have the sort of more right of center pro-business side essentially celebrating it and saying, see, Amazon is just fine. And the left of center pro-union side saying, well, it's essentially impossible that workers, if truly given free choice, would have voted no. So this just must have been Amazon was not playing fair, and this shows how broken the union election system is, and we have to make it so next time the workers would vote yes. And it seems to me that this is neither cause for sort of celebration or complaining, but rather it underscores the tragedy that workers, in fact, have pretty consistently for a long time been saying unions as we have them in America today are not what they want. And you see this, there's a wonderful study done in the 90s by Professor Richard Friedman at Harvard called What Workers Want, that asked questions like, if given the choice between having some sort of representation that collaborated with management but had no power, or a form that had some power but management opposed, which one would you want? And workers choose roughly 3-to-1 the collaborative no power arrangement. Professor Thomas Captioning at MIT did a similar survey just a couple of years ago that found something similar, that found when you ask, would you want X in a union? Would this or that make you more likely to join a union? Almost everything you can think of was very popular, more benefits, collective bargaining, workplace representation, et cetera, et cetera. Two things actually workers said would make them less likely to join a union. One is political activism, and two is strikes. And so the two things that sort of labor activists most kind of love to talk about as the epitome of what unions, can bring to the table and do are in fact the things that turn workers off the most. And what's really important to recognize is that our system of labor in America is a kind of bizarre outlier. This idea that you're sort of supposed to go, factory by factory, workplace by workplace, and have an election, and the employer doesn't want the union, and the union has to get the workers to vote for it, and then either now you're unionized or you're not unionized. That's not how labor works in most places. In Europe, in particular, the model of labor tends to be much more at the industry level, which means two things. One, unions tend to be much more focused on providing actual benefits. So in a lot of countries, unions run the unemployment insurance system. Unions are heavily involved in the workforce training system. Unions are, if you got your healthcare benefits from a union, you wouldn't have to worry about moving employers if that union wasn't tied to the employer. And so unions actually provide things of value in return for which workers are, generally speaking, happy to pay dues. And the second thing then is that negotiation tends to take place at what's called the sectoral level. So sectoral bargaining means instead of the workers in the Bessemer warehouse and Amazon fighting over the Bessemer warehouse contract, you would have unions that represent the warehouse industry, and you would have a trade association that represents retailers, and they would sit down and work out terms and conditions for the retail industry or for warehouses. And then when you got down to the individual plant level, you would have that as the starting point. And if a group of workers wanted to essentially then have a more kind of voluntary and collaborative council that met with Amazon, and they wanted to agree on ways to depart from that main agreement, they could. But most of what would happen at the local level wouldn't be about fighting about those terms and conditions. It would actually be about making sure that workers felt like they had a voice and some representation in a non-confrontational way. And so, if you do things that way, and the last point I want to underscore is, so why are conservatives talking about this? At first glance, you describe something like sectoral bargaining, and you say like, whoa, that sounds like a real recipe for crony capitalism and throwing sand in the gears of the economy. But it's important to recognize that the alternative to workers and employers setting these kinds of agreements isn't just nothing, it's government regulation. And so one thing that you find is in European countries where unions and trade associations have the power to work things out, they actually do that. And they prefer doing it to having the government regulation. And so both when you think about something like the unemployment insurance system, and when you think about something like who's actually setting the rules of the road in the industry, it's actually the much smaller government, private arrangement model to say, gosh, it would be really nice if we had a form of organized labor that could play that role effectively. So that's one big role for organized labor that I think conservatives are enthusiastic about. A second is that when you think about these issues of inequality that we've been talking about, at the end of the day, either we are going to redistribute, or we are going to find structures within the market economy that actually distribute income more effectively. And giving workers more power in the labor market is a way to have better distributional outcomes emerge from the market rather than through government redistribution. So again, much better solution in a world where the naked free market isn't going to get it done itself. And then thirdly, just as a matter of institutions and mediating institutions in the society, sources of solidarity and support, the union is a really important one. And I think its demise has been very harmful to working class communities. And so finding a form of union that workers would in fact embrace again and could provide them with resources, I think is one of the best policy mechanisms conservatives have to advance some of those priorities.
So this is going to be the last question, and probably a short answer to finish on time here. But we haven't talked much about politics, actually. Can you give me a path by which the views that you've outlined, your view of conservatism, gains credibility with Republicans and probably also with conservative Democrats?
Well, I think you see it happening already. I think Donald Trump was obviously neither a conservative nor a libertarian. But one way to sort of understand his rise through the Republican Party was exploiting these sort of blind spots that had gone untended for too long. And what you see in the aftermath of Trump, I think, is a real fight within the right of center between what I would call pre-Trumpism and post-Trumpism. There are a lot of folks who say, great, he's gone. We can go back to exactly what we were doing before he came along. And there are folks like me and the work we're doing at American Compass that say, look, Donald Trump obviously didn't have the answers. I liken him to an earthquake. Earthquakes knock a lot of things over. They don't do the rebuilding, but it is a tragedy, but there is also value in finding out what the weak structures were. And it provides an opportunity for renewal. And you'll have some people charge in and who like things the way they were and want to just put them back up. But a lot of people say, no, this is a real chance to learn and build something better. And so I think there's real energy within the right of center in America for doing that right now. I think if you look in the Senate as an example, I think you see in particular, four folks who I always highlight are Senators Rubio, Romney, Hawley, and Cotton, all of whom are tremendously thoughtful, and all of whom, they have points of agreement and disagreement, but are really notable in that they have very strong conservative principles, but they are trying to apply those to today's problems instead of pulling out the playbook that was developed in 1980 and kind of flipping through to find which tax cut they should propose today. And that's where a lot of the energy is. And one thing Trump showed is there's a lot of political support there, that there are an awful lot more folks, particularly in the working class, across ethnic lines, across religious lines, across gender lines, who find a very appealing, a socially conservative message married to more of an economic focus on the working class. And that brings in a lot of formerly Democratic voters, and I think it brings in a lot more then it loses from the more sort of libertarian or country club Republican set. Now, the way Donald Trump did it, it also lost a tremendous number of the suburban vote. And there was not a governing majority there. The question that I think we are going to find out the answer to over the next couple of years is, what if you had something that looked more like Trump's coalition based on attention to these kinds of economic concerns while maintaining social conservative values, but you did it without the sort of most abrasive elements of Trump that drove people away? Is there a sweet spot there? It might turn out there's not, that those things are incompatible in some way. But if there is, it is something that greatly scares the Democratic Party, and I think has probably the greatest potential right now to form a future governing majority. Now, the flip side is the Republican Party could swing back to pre-Trumpism, and there are some folks in the Democratic Party who are working on this very hard. And I think you could see a less woke, more working class focused Democratic Party that could be successful as well. But there's something about bringing back a more conservative economics that I think has the potential to rejigger some of our assumptions about political coalitions and both make potentially substantive policy progress, finding agreement where there wasn't before, but also bringing together different folks.
Terrific. Well, I want to thank you very much for your talk and also for your book, which I just found, I think, refreshing is the adjective that I would use, just to have a different perspective on what often feels like a very stale political debate. So thank you for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was great to see you also.
Thank you all. Thanks so much. Let me just unpin here so I can concentrate a little bit better. Okay, thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Cass and Professor Wheelan. That was a truly memorable Brooks Family Lecture program. We appreciate it. To the audience, sorry we didn't have time to get answers to all of your questions, but Mr. Cass has graciously agreed to sit for an interview with one of our student assistants. So check out our podcast, Rocky Talk, and you may find that your questions got answered in that format instead. Thank you all for joining. Next week, the Rockefeller Center is not hosting a Rocky Watch events. We have several co-sponsored events. Please check our website to see about those. Our next Rocky Watch event will be Thursday, April 29th, when we are pleased to be hosting NPR's legal affairs correspondent, Nina Totenberg, at 7 o'clock. So we hope we'll see most of you there. Again, thank you all so much for spending time with us. And thank you, Mr. Cass and Professor Wheelan, for a great evening.